Hello. So I wanted to make a video to kind of document the study that I've been doing up to this point. And I wanted to get more clear about what my preflop strategy is. So I know it's a simple concept and you could just look this stuff up, but I play in these 510 unranked games with a fairly regular crew of people. And something that I had just been noticing since coming back to poker after like 7 months off was I might have had the intuition for navigating post flop, and I still have that, I feel. And I have the recorded study of post flop play in order to know that I've been to check and see if I've been doing everything right. But I don't have that for pre flop. And so I wanted to look at some pre-flop scenarios and sort of log a set of pre-flop ranges that I can use in game and know that I'm sticking to my plan. So I'm doing that in two ways. One, I'm going to log my ranges as pictures, and then I'm going to make this video so that I can, if I ever take an extended amount of time off again, I can come back to this video and watch it and see. So I wanted to start from the small blind, and my reason for wanting to start from the small blind is that I believe that all pre-flop really like a major pull on a lot of pre-flop ranges is stealing, and basically I want to start with the idea of stealing and stealing spots. So I'm going to look first. I'm going to show you first. This is a small blind complete range, a small blind raise first in of 3.5 big blinds, also alongside a completing range. So it folds to the small blind, and the small blind is allowed to raise or complete. Now, one thing that is worth noting about this range is this is about the widest that we can expect to see from a preflop range, including hands such as 10 deuce, 8-4, queen 5, 5-4 off. Those are not hands that are going to find their way into a preflop range very often. And the reason is that we're incentivized to steal. Well, let's go back actually for a second and say that it's not about stealing so much. Jack deuce, king deuce Jack deuce is a clear steal, it seems. But these other hands are sort of encouraged actually just to play. So the price that we get as a small blind completing, forcing our opponent, who is the big blind, to complete alongside us with hands that just make sense to. These hands just actually get to play. And there's a lot of them in here. And I think it's interesting that there's a lot of them in here because, you wouldn't expect necessarily any percentage of 5-4 to want to go post flop for free, or actually to pay half a big blind in order to go post flop against somebody else. But you can. And they will, and they want to, even versus an opponent who will play perfect against us in position. It does assume that we also play perfect, and we don't. So these are two little variables, but that they show up at all, I find really interesting. I'm going to pause for a second, and then I'm going to show a different range. Here we have another range. I'm going to try to zoom in. Here we have a small blind range that is an RFI only range. And I've built in to this range the hands which continue through a 4-bet and a call, the hands which continue through a 4-bet, and that's the pink, sorry. The hands that continue through a 4-bet and a fold to a 5-bet, and that's the blue. The hands which just call, and the hands that RFI and call a 3-bet, which is the green, in the hands that RFI and fold to a 3-bet, which is the red. Something that's worth noting is that this range is significantly smaller. There's no 5-4, there's no 7-6 off, there's no queen 6, queen 7, queen 8, king 7, there's slivers of king 7, there's no jack deuce. This is, in theory, just as appropriate of a planned play in a rake-free game. But what is interesting is that if we look here, and we look at this RFI only range, and this is, this is that range, is that, and this is just a different sim than I'd run before, is that the total VPIP of an RFI only range is so much smaller. So this is 43.4 total VPIP, while here we have 62.5. So 62.5 versus 43.4, about a 20% increase, 19% of hands increase that we get to VPIP when we complete. So just to say that this is about the tightest we can that we could possibly be from the small blind, is a 43.4% RFI only range. And the difference between the response of a perfect opponent versus when we RFI only with a much smaller VPIP versus when we RFI and also have a completing range alongside them, we can see that the small blind is minus 204 big blinds in the small blind completing ranges, and minus 2.12. So about 1/8% of a big blind, which is not that much. But again, it's worth considering that we're looking at models that are perfect in a sense, where the post-flop play is perfect between both opponents. In general, if you feel as though you will make better decisions than your opponent, you will want to VPIP more often. And the fact that the small blind allows you to VPIP more often against one opponent without having to think of multiple opponents who can punish you, but just one opponent, and knowing how much they might punish you, you obviously, if you know that you're going to make better decisions than them, you would want to VPIP more. If you know that you don't know, I guess, that you want to make better decisions and you want to simplify your decisions, you may just choose to RFI everything. And that is not a terrible mistake in terms of EV that you stand to gain. The only thing about it is you just need to know. This actually has to be a simpler system to implement than RFIing some hands and completing other hands. Now, looking at this might be pretty annoying to one's brain to think about trying to implement. So they might just think, well, it's just easier to RFI everything. But we can figure out ways to simplify, and we can figure out ways to simplify and exploit. So the next question is, if this is an RFI only range versus a perfect opponent, that is good. And this is an RFI and completing range against a perfect opponent, what happens when we're not playing perfect opponents? And the answer might surprise you. I have a model in which I have changed the big blind's defense. Let's look at that big blind's defense. When we raise in a raise versus complete model against a perfect opponent, they are 3-betting about 16% of hands, including this whole top section, a bunch of smattering of other stuff, and defending 40%. Let's look at that in this Well, I guess it's all there. So they're defending hands like 4 deuce suited, Jack deuce suited, 10 deuce suited, A's, King 7 off, 5-4 off. Okay. When we complete, and our opponent has 100% of hands, they are raising all of this. They are ISOing our completing range with all of this, with Queen 6, with Queen 5, with King 4. And they are only really using hands, the absolute worst hands, to just complete behind with no attack, right? And they would only be raising to 3.5 big blinds. So it's like a limp. They raised to 35 over a limp in a 5-10 game. So that might be why this range is so wide. But just to say, these are a lot of hands to be raising versus a complete. In an equilibrium model, this is surprising to see, I think. So what I did is I made the player a bit tighter. Something closer to what we would likely see from players in our game. So when we raise, our opponent is now... I've clipped some of the hands, essentially. I've left all the ace, because I don't think anybody actually does fold an ace when you open from the small blind. I've left in some percentage of hands. But really all I did is clip a lot of this stuff. This Jack deuce, this Queen stuff, this 10 stuff, this 9. And I said 10-7 suited good, 10-6 suited they might just say trash, right? They might say 9-5 suited trash. This makes sense. 8-4 suited trash. Like all of these hands that they're expected to defend, they no longer call. In the 3-betting range, I made more linear and more probably accurate to what you would see when you get 3-bet. Jacks plus, we might get flatted by 10 some of the time. We get less and less flatted by these hands, but I left them in there anyway. I left the percentages that they had for hands that I thought, oh, maybe they could 3-bet them. I even left in 9-6 just to say. So not terribly smaller, not terribly different, but just taking out the nonsense, the stuff that I really don't think I'd see. So we go from a 16.1% 3-bet to about a 11% 3-bet. So just taking off 5% of hands from this range, which is kind of crazy stuff in here that you would just not get 3-bet 18% of the time by Jack 3. You'd get 3-bet 0% of the time by Jack 3, or 9% of the time by 3s. You get 3-bet not 0% of the time by 3s, right? These are all things that just don't make sense to actually happen in the real world. And then I clipped the 40% defense range down to 39.7. So I pushed a bunch of those hands that were 3-bets into the calling range, and then about 5% of them, and clipped some completely. But in total, we've only gotten the range down about 5%. Further, I have changed the range that ISOs, small blinds, complete, to hands that make a lot of sense. Any offsuit 9 plus, with some slivers of completes back. Pocket pairs, pretty much all of them besides deuces, all of these suited connectors and gappers, even 10-7, King 7. All of these hands which really do make sense to be seen as ISOs, even from regs. You would see a reg ISO this range, a lot of regs ISO this range when you complete the small blind. So this isn't and then check back everything else. So complete everything else, check back everything else, which makes sense. Of course, they wouldn't fold. And what we get is a very surprising range. So not so outrageous. And this is what we get for a raising range of 3.5x and our completing range. We have now gone from an RFI of 43.4 to an initial small blind and complete range of 62.5 to now a range that only folds about 13% of the time. That's kind of crazy. And it's really just this 9-4-8-4 and these like unsuited deuces. Another interesting piece of this is that the range is so heavy on the low suited cards that this is kind of all mixed stuff. This is obvious, but this low suited area is just like we're just mashing it. You could imagine if someone really didn't defend, like this is, again, not that crazy of a guess at what even regs in a 5-10 game are doing and what they're ISOing with. And this is the response that it gives. You could think the best winningest player in your casino at 5-10, you could do this against them and make money and make the most money possible. And I think that's pretty interesting and crazy. What I wanted to do with this then is I wanted to make a version of it that makes sense, that I can check in game without having it, check, not in a hand, but after a hand, just look and be like, oh yeah, that was what my plan was, and kind of drill it that way. And I'm going to show that range real quick. So then this is what that range will look like. And I've color coded it. So I have the reds and the blues as raises, 3.5x. I have the greens as completes. And I have this sort of like purple area, which are just hands that are like, they could do anything. And what's useful about something like this is that you get to see, you have hands that you're always going to open, ace 8 plus, yada yada. You have hands that you're always going to complete, and then you have hands that really get to change your range depending on how tight exactly to the T the person that is on your left is. And it allows you to sort of swap hands in and out of the range as you're more or better off, right? Like, the effect of bunching is something to consider. If you are in a situation which you're small and you're in a full ring game, 10-handed or something, and you have a full ring of bunching occurring, you'd probably actually pure raise all this king X, all this queen X, all this ace X, and you'd skip out on 5-4, 6-5, 7-5, and such. As if you're playing four-handed, you might actually just opt to raise this over this if, for whatever reason, you wanted to be trickier, yet still take advantage of an overfolder. Another thing to consider is, against someone who's really, really tight, you could probably raise every hand here. But it's interesting that even against a perfect opponent, they're giving us the ability to raise all of this and have a range that is almost always folding to an ISO. So we didn't lock. If we were to complete and get raised, we are continuing with 2.5% of hands. Like just a complete disrespecting small blind strategy is something that is probably really good versus a lot of people. I'm going to pause and I'm going to bring up one more range. So my next thought really is, then what is what is the adjustment for a loose passive? So somebody who's calling quite a bit in the big blind, but not 3-betting us actually all that much. And I left the 3-bet range the same. And I started to go model this idea, and I just basically thought it's not that interesting. We can kind of come to some conclusions on our own and build our own range. The conclusions being that our completion is really determined in a rakeless game or a time-raked game. It is determined by how often our opponent is ISOing us back. And if our opponent is ISOing a sort of linear cutoff opening range or something, then we're free to complete quite a bit. And if they, so our completion, even versus somebody who's really loose, can be really loose. So here's my guess. Here is my guess at a strategy that I think would be pretty good versus a loose caller who doesn't 3-bet enough, which is another type of person you'll see even at 5-10. And now it's less scattered. And the reason we're less scattered is like less hands are clearly like a mixed incentive to raise to steal versus just completing. Because we're not stealing anymore. The stealing is not a thing we're interested in. What we're instead interested in is punishing with domination of a range post-flop. So what we can do then, what I did basically is I took the RFI only range and I cut it back a bit to ensure more domination than we would normally get. So we have higher kings, higher queens, pretty much all ace. We could have done all ace, but that, and then the small suited connectors I left in there because it feels sacrilegious to actually take out these small suited connectors from any large range. There is an argument where like 5-4 suited just does really well against a tight range, doesn't do well at all against a loose range. And I know this, and I don't care because I just can't I can't do that to my little buddy. But this pink mix range is now hands that could be raised depending on how loose the opponent is, as they offer blocking of calls as best we can. And also, like, if someone's really loose, that doesn't mean they're going to tighten up post, right? So these are just hands that perform kind of okay in a pot of really wide range versus really wide range. And you can, I feel like I could pilot them fairly well. Like if I have Jack 3 and I open and I hit top pair, I would just check, see what's going on, right? Like I check, I don't blow to pot right away. I try to figure out what's going on with my opponent's range, and I try to see if I can even sneak a bet in there or if I have to check it down. And I feel comfortable doing that, but a lot of people don't necessarily feel comfortable flopping top pair with Jack 3 against an opponent who they're trying to dominate, and really navigating that to post flop. But it really depends on the opponent and how annoying they'll make your life on later streets. And that's why they're in that mixed category. But everything else can be just a pure 4x open as opposed to a 3.5x open. That punishes their range just a little bit more, makes the pot just a little bit bigger, and allows you to just get more money against a sticky player on later streets. So that's that strategy. So then we come back to this range right here, which is a standard that we can think of for what we want to do. like if we're playing somebody who is good, which we honestly rarely will. We will most often be playing against somebody who under defends the big blind and under aggresses against completes. Or we are punishing somebody who's like a little bit too loose by raising too wide because they just can't get it within them to 3-bet enough against a bigger size, right? But they also just can't fold stuff. Anyway, going back, we want a standard strategy too. We can adjust, but we need a center line to shift from. Now we have the directions. We have the far edges of where we'll go, and they're much wider than we initially thought, and that's exciting, right? We're in both ranges. We're folding 15% at most from the small blind. But that can't be what we always do, because we'll run into somebody who's like, hey, this person's never really folding their small blind, and I saw them show up with 7-3 suited. I'm going to have to do something about that. And what most people will do is do something about that. Means they'll try to find a hand that they can do something about it with, and it's going to be the hands that are in this range, whatever it is. I can't find it. Oh yeah, it'll be like these hands. They'll be like, oh, I'm really gonna get them once I can finally get my 8-6 suited. So it's not actually a problem. But let's say that there are people causing you problems, and you want to practice playing this, right? Well, you can simplify this down to something that is able to be looked at. So what I did. So I took the hands near 100 and I made them pure raises. I took the hands that were near 0 and I made them pure calls. I then made a category for these sort of 70-30 hands on each side, and I bucketed them there, and then took all the 50-50s and I put them in. And I'm going to show you what those ranges look like. So this is what that range looks like. And I bet you are just sort of thinking, well, this isn't any easier. And it's not. We have the blues, which are the raises. These are the hands that always raise, including aces, which was an 80% or something, but I just kicked it up. Anything 80 or above, I just kicked up to a pure raise. Anything 80 above for call, I just kicked down to a pure call. Then we have these light blues. These light blues are anything in the like 60 to 70 range of hands. For that action, and then the yellows are for the calls in that same 60 to 80 range of calls. So then they're in their own category. And then the pinks are the mixes. The pinks are these hands that are basically 50-50 and they don't care. So I was like, okay, that's not. And then there's these oranges that are either calls or folds, but it never raises. Okay. So that's basically how we could be precise about that range. Let's go back. This would be the range that I would use. That feels a little bit more usable. What we did is we then kicked up everything that was 60 or plus into a raising range. Anything that was 60 or plus for calls, kicking into a calling range. And then there's this sort of wiggle room area of hands that can go either way. And what I did is I compared that range to the actual equilibrium. So what I did was, I don't have that sheet anymore, but I made a little sheet where I calculated exactly how much ace X, exactly how much king X, and all this stuff were in each range, exactly how many combos were in each range. And then compared it to this, which I used for 1s for raises, 0s for calls, and 0.5s for these mixes. And what it came out to was about a good replica of that range. So this is basically a GTO range that is somewhat implementable in these rake-free or time rake games. So now we have a standard for how to play the small blind that we can shift. And a lot of these hands that end up as raises are the hands that end up as raises for versus tight players. So we end up finding patterns, I believe, when we start implementing this more and building it into our game. Now, the only other thing to then think about is how do we become a menace from the small blind? If it's so easy to take advantage of big blind defense, how do we keep ourselves from being exploitable in the big blind versus a small blind in a blind versus blind scenario? And all I did was take that range and made it fairly viewable again in the same way. These are hands that always fold and that are fine to fold. These are completely fine folds. Every single one of these hands are hands that when facing, and this is versus a small blind RFI only range, right? All of these hands are hands that always fold in a rake-free game. All of these hands that are green are hands that have to be defended. And some of them not even, like these edge cases. There's some edge cases like 9-7 off, 7-3, that don't actually, maybe King 6, that don't actually have to be defended all the time. But if you're good enough, it won't matter. You won't lose EV. They're probably like minus 0.04 big blinds anyway. And then you have these hands that always raise, that are just so close to being pure raises that it doesn't even matter to call them pure raises. And then you have just all these mixes. And the fun thing about this is that you just get to choose depending on how your opponent plays. I like, if an old man coffee raises me from the small blind, I probably will 3-bet 9-7. I probably will 3-bet Queen Jack suited. I probably will just 3-bet all these hands that I have as pure raises. But I might not 3-bet 10-7. But I will 3-bet 10-5 because God damn it, I have committed to my strategy. Okay? But you really also just get to pick and choose again hands that have certain qualities about them. For example, King Queen is a very good hand to 3-bet in a couple different scenarios. One, if you want folds. If you think that you're getting a fold more often than a 4-bet from the range that you're 3-betting, King Queen is a great hand to have, as is Queen 8, as is Ace 6, as is any of these offsuit aces. These are good hands to play, to push opponents who fold. If you think your opponent's going to call too much, well, then 7-6 and 7-5 and 8-7 and 8-6 and 5-3. Those are all good hands to 3-bet. If you think your opponent's calling too much and they just like don't have a fold button and they're calling hands like King 5 suited where they probably shouldn't, or King 9 off, right? Then you probably just want 9s. You probably want 8s and 10s, and you want these hands that, could not do that. So this is a way that we can look at this range and have it make sense, is that these hands have to be 3-bet. These hands have to be called, and these hands really have to be like artistically placed in your strategy. They have to really be thought about and considered when you get Jack 6 in the big blind and you get opened against and you have an option to 3-bet. What does Jack 6 do? Does it play well? Do you need it to play well? Do you need it to block stuff that your opponent would then call with? Or do you just need a hand that can make it post flop? But either way, you're going to have to play this hand, and that's something that a lot of people are uncomfortable doing, and they just choose not to. But blind versus blind, it really is difficult to not call this range. You really have to be up, especially as deep as we are. Like, even if you're playing someone with aces, you just call with 4 deuce and you just try to make 2 pair on the flop and just try to get it all in, as fast as you can, right? Like, all of these hands, it just doesn't make sense to fold. You make a good fold later, but not pre-flop. That's the strategy, basically. And that's all I've got. So thanks for watching.